All right, I think we're going to get started now. Thanks everyone for joining today and welcome. I'm June McCartan, an urban planner with Outwith Studio. This is our latest training session for the New Hampshire Housing Toolbox, which is a collection of tools that was recently released and is specifically directed to housing production. Today, we're joined by Donna Benton, the Director of Planning and Community Development from the City of Dover. And she's our guest today because we're talking transfer of development rights. So this is a tool that has a lot of interesting potential and a lot of interesting uses, some of which are in Dover specifically. So just a little note on logistics. We're going to have a presentation. I'll do a little more of an overview on transfer of development rights and how we discuss it in the toolbox. And then I'll pass it over to Donna, who's going to talk about Dover specific implementation. After the presentation, we'll do a question and answer session. During that session, if you could raise your hand via Teams, that way we'll know you're there with a question. And to do that, there's a little icon that you can see. It looks like a hand and it says raise. You can also like always throw questions in the chat, questions or comments, either during the presentation or during the Q&A, and we'll use the chat as a way to get those answered. The chat is also accessible via Teams. There's a little like speech bubble icon that says chat underneath, and that's all in the toolbar. Great. So I'll start today by talking a little bit about the toolbox. So this is a collection of 20 planning and zoning strategies for housing production in New Hampshire communities. So it's everything from broad approaches to housing and housing development to specific regulatory strategies around zoning, around finance, etc. You can access it in two ways. There's a PDF that's been floating around for a little bit, and there is a website where you can engage with this content interactively and share specific strategies, etc. Both of those are accessible at nhhousingtoolbox.org. That's nhhousingtoolbox.org. The Toolbox project was part of the wider regional housing needs assessment process that went on statewide through the regional planning commissions. As such, it was funded by ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act. So it's a sort of federal funding passing through the state. And the toolbox itself was put together by a subcommittee of staff from regional planning commissions and New Hampshire Housing, and facilitated by the State Office of Planning and Development. There are two consultants that helped with the project, Outwith Studio, which is where I'm from. We helped sort of collate and put together the planning content, visual identity, and Boku, who put together the website. The toolbox tries to answer simple questions about the tools. So what is the tool? How can it help your community? How has it been used elsewhere? What does implementation look like? And where can you learn more? So it's really, we're trying to get the basics out of the way for people in local government. So it's meant for people working in and around local government, be that staff, planning board members, select board members, legislative body members, even local advocates, people who aren't necessarily have a formal role in government, but are active in their community. This saves folks time on upfront research and points them in the direction of more detailed content where they can start to adapt the tool generally to their local context. The structure of each tool, which you'll sort of see previewed in our discussion today, is sort of what is the tool, how can it help, getting started, which is sort of like notes on implementation, considerations, which are sort of points of concern or sort of nuances that we get into, things that you want to look out for as you start to think about the tool in your own community, resources, which is a list of external resources, issues addressed, which is the way we've organized the toolbox content into sort of broad themes, and I'll touch on that in a second. Related tools within the toolbox, citations of state law, and then case studies. I noted that we sort of organized the toolbox by issues addressed. There's a way on the website to filter by these. There also is a sort of a matrix in the introduction of the PDF. And we use these to help you as local planners to think about, all right, what are the issues that your community is most facing, and sort of what might be the tools that touch on that specifically. So housing options, that's sort of the diversity of housing types. Housing costs is like the cost of like market rate housing, like what's the broad affordability without any subsidy or deed restrictions. Affordable housing is sort of deed restricted affordable housing, like formally restricted sort of workforce housing. Sustainable housing, so housing that's less resource intensive or land consumptive. Multi-generational options specifically, so that's almost like a subset of housing options, but is really focused on housing types that aren't, serving families who don't meet, traditional quote unquote models. Infrastructure, so where there's a lack of infrastructure capacity, how can you either get more infrastructure to enable housing development, or sort of focus your efforts on places where there is capacity. And then redevelopment, focused on like vacant lots under building. So we'll sort of run through how we talk about transfer of development rights in the toolbox as a way to sort of introduce the concepts and the themes that are involved, and we'll sort of hopefully dive deeper into the nitty gritty with Donna's work in Dover. Transfer of development rights are essentially laws and processes that allow landowners to buy and sell allowed development capacity, concentrating housing where there's infrastructure and other amenities. So if you think you have, just take, say, a town where part of it has maybe a historic village center, and then that area is surrounded by rural land like farms or open space or that sort of thing. But the town is all zoned for housing, or there's some housing allowance built into even these agricultural zones. It's a way to shift that allowed capacity from typically those like more rural areas or open spaces, which might be not as well suited for housing development, and shift that capacity from those areas into, say, that village center or similar area that has the infrastructure, has the amenities, is sort of set up to accommodate new housing better. So we typically call that more rural area the sending zone, because they're sending capacity from their area to a receiving zone, which would be that sort of village center-y type area. It doesn't always have to be, say, a village center, formally already or something like that, but that's often how you do see it used. And those sending zones and receiving zones would sort of, like any zoning district, be codified in law, and so you would have clear, distinctions on what's a sending zone and what's a receiving zone. So it's not, left ambiguous or up to a decision-making body every single time. There are a lot of examples of transfer of development rights laws out there. Not all of them are used. And it's important that they really require administrative capacity and sort of predictable permitting practices to make them function well. So broadly speaking, they take some ongoing administration and monitoring to ensure that, like, a party that's trying to sell allowed development capacity and the party that's receiving it know how this transaction works, that it's not just something that's being done kind of privately between the parties, but it's something that the town is involved in, and the town has capacity to sort of administer that process. And then predictable permitting practices are important because, in part because, you're essentially creating this piece of value that can move around, this sort of credit that says this is one housing unit. And in order to buy and sell that, you need to know really what that's worth. And so if there's a lot of ambiguity about how much a given landowner can build, that could create difficulties creating predictable values, and then you get into a sort of mess of parties and counterparties trying to figure out what this thing is worth, and ultimately it's just not adopted by landowners as often. And I'll just note this is identified as an innovative land use control under RSA 674-21. It's section D there. This been recognized by the state as something that is available to local communities as a way to ensure not only more and better housing outcomes, but more and better development outcomes generally. So how can it help? One of the biggest ways it can really help is it can co-locate housing with existing infrastructure and amenities. So you're, even though everyone might have that sort of same financial stake in the land that they had before, it doesn't mean that the only way to realize their value in their land is to build housing where it might not be as well suited. There might be a part of town that, say, has sewer capacity or has existing road capacity, and that might not be where the land is located. And so this is a way to shift that housing potential from areas with less capacity to areas with more capacity. As such, it's a way to preserve open space, agricultural, and low density areas. It can really also unlock housing potential from parcels that would otherwise be infeasible or ultimately lower capacity. So the landowner in a sending zone, this more rural zone, might technically be allowed to build housing on their land to do some sort of subdivision. But the reality of actually, doing the site work, perk testing the land and building out all of that, it might be barriers to essentially development. They might be relatively low barriers, they might be relatively high barriers, but they're barriers nonetheless. And so this, again, shifts that capacity from places where the potential for development in real life isn't there, and moves it to places where development is much more feasible. It can maintain community character by preventing sort of sprawl style development and doing more compact village style development where that would be appropriate. I've seen some implementations where it can help transition from higher density to lower density areas. So rather than going from just more like walkable village or urban context and going straight into sort of conventional single family development, this can provide some sort of buffer area. It also works with sort of transitions sometimes between commercial zones and residential zones. And then it can encourage small and alternative housing types without increasing overall development in the community. And this becomes an important, almost at like a community discussion level or potentially a fiscal level. So if a community might want, say, more compact housing types, housing that's more accessible on a more typical income. But they might be concerned that by allowing more compact development, they're increasing overall density, and this might put a stress on, say, the school system or something of that nature, or the water capacity, something like that. And this is a way of saying, okay, we can get those more accessible housing types without increasing the overall number of homes we're permitting, um, and by just sort of shifting it around. And I think this is an interesting one because this toolbox is really focused on housing production, and we actually know that we're in a housing shortage and we need greater overall housing production. But I think it is a tool that can be applied in certain ways that can mollify concerns about overall capacity when there are very real fiscal constraints or something like that. So it's just something I bring up. So how do you go about doing this? The first piece of all of this is always connect it to master plan goals. So if you have goals about preservation, diversity of housing types, things like that, sort of make that connection clear that like, okay, we've set these goals and this is a way of achieving them. Or if there's an ongoing master plan process, include this as a specific recommendation to implement a TDR zone. As part of your sort of like planning level, identify sort of ideal sending and receiving zones. So on the sending side, rural places, open spaces, on the receiving zones, more built up areas. So next would be conduct a real estate financial analysis to determine a sort of per unit value of housing development and publish your findings. So this is, again, getting back to like, what's the value of allowed housing development? So not what's the price, the average price of a home sold in your community, but what's the value of that allowance to develop a single unit of housing? And this is a way to sort of set expectations about what these values will be. Once you are getting into a situation where there's a buying and a selling of a housing credit, that those are private party transactions. You're not sort of necessarily overseeing what the dollar figure is, but by creating this sort of transparent analysis upfront, you are setting expectations so that you are sort of creating a coherent market at the start. Next would be audit your regulations, your sort of laws and regulations, and identify any changes needed to make transfer of development rights work. So if you set up the system, but you're still not allowed to build denser housing anywhere, you're not actually creating an implementable logical system. So it's important that you recognize those gaps, and in either a broad zoning way or in a TDR specific implementation, you address those gaps. So, all right, so you've identified what could be ideal zones. You've understood what the housing financial analysis is, and you've identified the regulations that might need to change. Now comes public engagement to sort of bring all of that into the conversation and have a real discussion about like, what is this system? What are the trade-offs involved? And sort of get the public to weigh in on like what could be a sending receiving zone and how the program would actually work, including all the little sort of nuances. So like credit banking, and I'll get to that in a minute, but there's a lot of design questions that go into making a TDR law. This would be a way to sort of begin to vet those. So you've done your engagement, you have a pretty good understanding of what the community wants, you draft legislation, and then ultimately, fingers crossed, adopt it. That would allow transfer of development rights, sets those sending and receiving zones, sets the process for approval, and then making any other changes to zoning laws, subdivision laws, et cetera, that would enable the usage of this program. And again, that can be, a sort of broad change in the zoning, or in theory, it would be tied to the TDR specifically. So if you'd purchase, 10 credits to build housing from a rural zone to your parcel in a more villagey zone, then you can get this density bonus that you might not otherwise receive. And then it's time to sort of go out and make the market. So you've created a system where individual property owners can buy and sell these credits. with the administrative oversight of the town, you need to actually publicize that. So you need to have conversations with property owners where it might be relevant, and certainly the rural property owners, to inform them this is an option that they have on the table. And then if you're setting up things like a bankable TDR credit where someone can sell credit without necessarily a purchase on the other active development on the other side, then you can even think about like, okay, should our town buy some of these credits to preserve the rural areas that we have, and then save them for when there's a development on the table in our more developed areas. So some considerations, I've already kind of teed some of these up. Having a law on the books doesn't automatically yield adoption by developers. I've seen TDR laws that have been on the books for 15 years and no one's even touched it, either because the sending and receiving zones weren't right, or there was just not a lot of knowledge amongst landowners that this option existed, or there were just like active users that weren't ready to pull the trigger one way or another on their property. So all that's to say, you need to align the law with potential supply and demand, and those value of the development rights must be understood by sort of everyone who could be involved in the transaction. Certainly the landowners who might be selling their development rights, and then maybe not the landowners, but potential developers in your community who might purchase a property and sort of flip it into housing. If permitting, I noted this earlier, if permitting processes are highly discretionary and it almost becomes unpredictable how many units a given property might yield, then the per unit value of development might be difficult to pin down. And again, getting two parties to agree on what that value is might be difficult to do. So general practice, make your permitting system predictable. But certainly if implementing TDR, that sort of system level predictability is going to be important. And then I mentioned bankability. So this is where a selling party can sell their allowable development, and someone, typically a trusted third party, can purchase it without an active development on the other side, and then sell it later when there's a development in a more developed part of town in the receiving zone. In theory, and this does happen, these can be totally private bankable credits. So anyone could go and purchase development credits and then sell them down the line. That's obviously a trickier situation. You don't want something that can be exploited by sort of a predatory actor or something like that. So if you are setting up a banking system, it's important that, again, there's predictability in pricing, and then there are at least local governments or some other trusted actor like a housing or redevelopment authority who's kind of like minding the shop and making sure things aren't going out of whack. TDR frameworks certainly do face opposition when they're when they're being implemented. And this often happens because of the potential increased density in the receiving zone beyond what they're already zoned for. So again, opposition is a normal, healthy part of city and town life. It's to be expected and cherished. But if you want to set up a system that will ultimately work for the community and sort of convince the opposition, then it should be clearly aligned with community goals and sort of connecting it back to previous public discussions, and like don't skimp on the public engagement part. And then noted earlier, staff capacity to promote, administer, and monitor the program is key to TDR success. I think that's certainly where much of Dover's success has come from, but it's going to be key in any community. So I'll broadly touch on some case studies. I'm talking a little bit more than I wanted to. But I just want to note the ones we discussed in the toolbox. I think they offer some interesting points and counterpoints. The most storied TDR program in the history of US planning is Montgomery County, Maryland. So this is adjacent to Washington, D.C. and covers, a very, urban D.C. context out to a very sort of rural agricultural context. They've set up something called the Agricultural Reserve Zone, which is in the maps you see here, the green part on the left. And this is the most rural area. This reserve zone has been in place for quite a long time, several decades. And then on the other side of that, there are the TDR overlay zones, and this is as of February 22, sort of where landowners in the green zones can sell their housing development capacity to the blue zones. And it's worked rather well. There's been hundreds of thousands of acres preserved in that green zone under this program. It's been an important tool. It's not to say that the county hasn't seen sort of large scale sprawl style development, but in the green zones, it's been relatively preserved, and in the blue zones, the development has tended to be more compact, sort of walkable, less intrusive into the more rural areas around it. So that's a really large scale example, and I bring it up in part because it's really large, county-wide. Maryland has county governments principally, no cities or towns. So this is the level in which it's administered. And obviously they're able to capture the great difference between being the suburbs of Washington, D.C. to being a rural area. But I wanted to note Stowe, Vermont as well. They've had a relatively long-standing program that has done similar things, but at a town level and in a New England context. So they've been able to preserve, these sort of tracts of meadowlands and have used the development capacity not only to build up their existing historic center, but do economic development in other parts of town. So this is not the most iconic part of Stowe up on the top right, but is a sort of different part of town that had its own sort of village center. And the TDR program has been used to try to build up and do specific economic development in that area of town. And then the image on the bottom right is a development. This is a rather interesting one. They used the mechanism of TDR to transfer development capacity from a rather large site owned by a single owner over into one part of the site. So it's essentially a way to take one single landowner and do more concentrated development, almost in a planned unit development style. And so it was an odd example. I've not seen much like it. But I thought it opened up the door to what sort of flexibility the TDR program that's usable can have. Next case study is King County, Washington, which includes Seattle and then Bellevue, and then a much wider area that stretches into the wilderness and the mountains. And so they have a really well-utilized TDR system that can take development capacity from that, almost pristine wilderness part of Washington and move it into, central Seattle and the Seattle suburbs. And what's interesting about this program, and the reason I bring it up, is that they actually have a functioning banking system. So credits can be purchased and held and then sold at a later time. They also have two different types of credits. You can have in their system rural credits, but they also do urban credits. And if you purchase an urban credit, that's a one-to-one. So you get one housing unit in your receiving zone for every one urban housing credit you buy from a sending zone. And then for a rural credit, it's a 2-to-1. So for every one housing credit you buy from a rural area, you get 2 housing units in this, again, very central Seattle. So it's just an interesting system, and it's a notable working banking system for these TDR credits. And then lastly, I won't talk too much about this, but is the cottages at Back River Road in Dover. And this is one of our case studies in the toolbox. Of course, we also have Donna from Dover here. But I will just want to highlight here the sort of layering of different tools. So this TDR was used to enable a cottage style development. So this is not either conventional single family or conventional apartment development. It's sort of small detached single family homes with a shared open space. And the TDR sort of worked with this cottage style development to get sort of densities that worked for the developer. And then also a portion of these units have cap rents and income eligibility and are sort of eligible workforce housing. So with that, I'll turn it over to Donna to talk about sort of Dover's implementation generally, but sort of wanted to segue with this Dover example from the toolbox.
Great. Thank you so much, June. So I'm Donna Benton. I'm the Director of Planning and Community Development in the City of Dover. I'm also the President of the New Hampshire Planners Association, so I want to give them a shout out. So I'm going to discuss a little bit about TDR specifically in Dover, and then get a little bit more into detail about this cottage project over on Back River Road. So Dover, to give you a background of where we are and who we are, we're about 33,000, just over 33,000 estimate in population. We're an old mill city, but we certainly have lots of open space. We're near the coast and near the state boundary with Maine, of course, located between Portsmouth and Rochester. And you can see, I'll point out on this slide as well as a future slide, that we have the Spalding Turnpike kind of diagonally as a spine through our city, and that has kind of formed a boundary between a couple different areas and options for transfer development rights in the city. So some discussion points and outcomes from the presentation today. I'll go over the ordinance from 1990 and then some changes we made in 2018 and further changes in 2020. It's really mixing conservation with housing affordability, but also trying to promote industrial users that would bring employment. We'll go over the example of the cottages and then go over key takeaways, and then I'm happy to answer any questions. So in general, before we get into TDR specifically, Dover has several ordinances that allow for the density. So in Dover, we don't have a density calculation required in the downtown. We haven't since 2010. We have a gateway district that leads into the downtown, and that offers a variety of density options from 2,000 to 4,000 square feet per unit versus 5,000. We don't have density if you HUD restrict your units. And then we also have created low density, one for 2,000 square feet of commercial in industrial zones over 40,000 square feet. And through TDR, we allow the density increase, and that's by unit rather than just by unit size like other communities. And we also allow for additional building height in certain zones if the resulting units are rent restricted. And that doesn't have to be kind of in that additional top floor, that can be throughout the building. And then more recent changes, we've allowed non-conforming lots to be developed if this house size is restricted. We've allowed more than one ADU in most of our residential zones if the second one is rent restricted. We used to allow conversion of single family to two family only if the house was built before 1964, but we've recently removed that requirement of being built before 1964. And then therefore, 2-family can be built by right in all residential districts. They just have to look like a single family home from the street to try to maintain that character. And then we've also removed the ZBA criteria for 3 or 4 family dwellings if they're rent restricted. So in 1990, we added TDR to our zoning regulations, and you can see that the receiving area is east of the Spalding Turnpike in the R20 and R40. So that would be lots that require 20,000 square feet of lot area or 40,000 square feet of lot area. I should mention that Dover has quite a bit of public water and sewer. We do also have plenty of lots that have well or septic. TDR, if you're doing the purchase option, has to be utilized on a lot that has public water and sewer. So I want to make sure I make that point, especially for smaller communities that might not have those utilities. So in 2018, we revamped our transfer of development rights ordinance, and we added in the opportunity to pay into the conservation fund at a rate that we review every year based off of land going into conservation. We take the purchase price, and the appraisal price of that land and how many acres it is. We kind of plot it out on a graph and figure out the averages. So last year we ended up changing it. For a while it was 13,402 from about 2018 to 2021, and then in 2021 we changed it to 15,000 based off what we were seeing for prices. And then in 2020 we added in the option for HUD rent restrictions. And if you were going to HUD rent restrict your rentals, then your TDR fee would be $0. And then we also made a couple more changes in 2020 that made the 2020 changes a little bit more user-friendly based off of having a set price on the size restrictions that were added in 2018. So if you size restrict your TDR unit to 1,400 square feet or 1,000 square feet, you get a reduced cost down from that $15,000 now. Or if you also size restrict or HUD restrict, that price also comes down. And then we also added in 2020 that residential density bonus for new industrial users like manufacturing. If they're over 40,000 square feet, then you get an additional units that regard. So that's a little similar to the land bank, but it's still with private. And then just now in 2023, we have posted amendments that have been recommended to City Council for approval. And they just slightly change our criteria of the transfer development rights for the planning board to review, since it is a planning board decision if they want to sell or trade that density. And we've also outlined more specifically a waiver process. So I went into the size restrictions. So in Dover, you have the opportunity to either preserve land in the different areas, or you can purchase it. So this conversation is probably more focused on the purchasing side of it. That's what we've been saying more since we've added that in 2018. So we do have the restrictions on the additions. We have both a formula. If it's a single family detached area, we would now be using a formula, which is shown on the screen. So you take a square foot of the parent lot, you take out about 15%, and that covers any unsuitable development areas, wetlands, wetland buffers. And then you also take out another 15% for any road networks and drainage areas that you would see are needed for the developed area. And then you take that leftover and divide it by the minimum lot size to get your base units. Anything over your base units would then be purchased. So 99 6th Street was an example in 2018 that kind of utilized the new ordinance. So they had a 90,000 square foot lot. They took out the wetland buffer unsuitable area, and they took out some area for the roadways to go in. And then they ended up with the 54,257. You divide that by the 12,000 square feet needed per zoning for that lot size. And they ended up with 4.52 units. So we've also changed it so you can't round up. So they would get 4 units. Anything over that, they would have to purchase. So cottages at Back River Road, many have heard of. This was a situation where the developers came to the city with kind of their mission of they owned a business in Durham. They were hearing from their employees that they weren't able to find affordable housing nearby, so they had longer commutes. So they found this piece of property to purchase in Dover, and they came to us and kind of told us this vision that they wanted to build these tiny homes on the property, and kind of how could we allow it, or what were the pathways to get to a yes. So we ended up revising the zoning ordinance, like I explained in those histories. And because it's a TDR subdivision and it's multiple homes on one lot, we were able to treat it like a site plan. So it still had to go for full review of landscaping, lighting, traffic studies, similar to any other project you would have for a site plan or subdivision. So this was the existing conditions. You can see it's right along the Bellamy River. The Red Barn Drive, you can see at the top of the screen, went in a few years before that. So those are single family homes that now are abutters to this new project. In this case, it was still using a yield plan. So this is the yield plan for how many lots could be allowed based off of our underlying zoning. And then this was their site plan. So we worked carefully and we brought key players in early. So that's a big takeaway that we'll go over. So police, fire, engineering for utilities, neighborhood meetings to make sure that we were doing everything in a way that would actually work. So we had to readjust the parking area that you see there, make that aisle width a little wider, and that way in fire code it could be considered an access way to help with the distance from the units for the closest access way, as well as you can kind of see that parking lot area next to unit 17. And that could also help for some fire prevention areas. This is designed specifically to look like different neighborhoods and kind of have some green space in between, be very walkable. So that's all walkable. There's obviously parking in the center, but each of those homes are the tiny homes. They have obviously their conservation district along the river, so that's helpful with those prime wetlands and shorelands, and walking trails along with the pavilion added. And that's also steep slopes, so that helps protect the steep slopes. So this, as you can see, it's outlined on our GIS with the different units there in an aerial view next to the Red Barn Drive, which I show because they became abutters that had concerns. And staff and the developer were able to sit down and try to help alleviate some of those concerns. So we were able to require additional landscaping and buffers and really work together as partners to help make sure that the Red Barn abutters could be as happy as possible, but still allow for the property rights for this to be developed too. So these were the sketches that were proposed to planning board. And you can see kind of the design. They're 340 or 384 square feet, about the average size of a hotel room to give you kind of the scale. This is when they were being built, and they still are being built. And you can see them under construction here. So you can see the close proximity. Obviously, this would be fully landscaped with the walkways and looking a lot prettier once that's in, that it's walkable, and trying to make sure that it's community based. And they'll also have, in the home that was existing on site, would be turned into community area and shared space if anyone wants to get together to watch the game or hold a party, that type of thing. So another picture. So to go over some benefits, obviously it's healthier living. It builds that community. It helps the environment with protection of the river nearby, and having that conservation space and the density closer together. It helps with economic development in terms of the employer and keeping their employees closer. They run a shuttle for their employees, plus they rent out, or they will be renting out kind of the balance of other units. They're all at the HUD restricted rates. They didn't have to pay the TDR fees. It just helps foster creativity and a diversity of housing, because it's kind of unique to be able to have your own four walls, but still at an affordable price. And that was really the main driver too. Of it's nice to have another option besides like the garden style apartments. And it ties into the master plan well. So takeaways, certainly don't be afraid to revisit your regulations. We're lucky in Dover that we're able to do that kind of at any point in the year. Site plan and subdivision, it's a lot easier. It's just at the planning board level. And for zoning regulations, which this obviously was, it's planning board and then city council, but we don't have to wait for a town meeting. We do have to send out a citywide mailing, so it is a cost to obviously revise our regulations, but that's something we try to do at least once a year. So also get creative and partner and work with developers you're seeing to get a better project. Like, don't be afraid to put that time and effort in. Make sure you bring the key players early, police, fire, abutters, engineering, looking at utilities, Eversource, or whoever is providing those services. And create that public buy-in, whether it's your board members and volunteers, abutters, just in general, to help create that buy-in. And once you have a better understanding of the concerns, then you can start problem solving and creating those solutions, which is helpful. And then also to remind people and educate them that they're still going through the full traffic study, stormwater analysis, all of those items you'd be seeing in any major subdivision or site plan anyway. And then also revert back to your vision and your master plan for your community to kind of help with that education and outreach. So those were the items I wanted to highlight, and I'm happy to answer any questions, or I'm sure June is as well. But that's the contact information, and that's the link you can find our latest TDR ordinance before these amendments have been made.
Great, thank you, Donna. I mean, the Dover example is so fascinating, in part because it has the sort of like classic mechanism built in, but there's also, the city has really gotten creative with like how to adapt this, legal mechanism to meet the community's needs and the real development market that they're seeing out there. So it's a very like unique and customized implementation of this. And I think that it really speaks to A, the flexibility of it, and then B, like how communities can adapt it to meet their needs. I think one thing that I particularly love about the system is the formula for you call it the purchase option. Is that what it is? Sure. Yeah, I think that using that as a system to try to like just take a lot of the ambiguity and sort of a yield plan system, or just give everyone a shared understanding of what the expectations are, I think probably goes a long way to making people more comfortable with it. So yeah, definitely able to answer any questions folks have. Complicated tool. Happy to talk through any part of it. Well, feel free to raise hands, or if Noah, you're seeing any hands raised, let us know here. Oh, we got a question in the chat. Can you go over again how the number of units were determined for the Dover example?
Sure. So in this situation, they use the yield plan. We've since have switched it so that if you're a single family, not multi-unit zoning, then you would now use the formula, but certain projects still use the yield plan, as did this one. So you take your base density and you'd have to make a yield plan based on following the zoning district. So in this regard, it's they have to pretend almost that they're building the public road to public standards. Every lot meets the required frontage in the required lot area of 12,000 square feet. The wetlands has to be taken out of that minimum lot size, and no more than 20% of the lot can be wetland buffer. And that's something that planning staff reviews and kind of says, okay, is this a realistic project? And that then gave them their underlying number. And then anything above that unit count would then be purchased. And I say purchased even though because they have size restrict, or because they've HUD rate restricted all these units, then that purchase number was $0 per unit. But if it wasn't, then it would be based off the size of this, I think it would be like $8,000 per unit.
And the three options you have now are, and feel free to retake control of the PowerPoint.
Oh, sure.
But you have sort of a way to purchase from other property owners, sort of that west of Spalding Turnpike versus east of Spalding Turnpike. Like, folks can still do that.
Correct. Yep. Yeah, you can still purchase land and conserve land in order to get density, or you can pay into the conservation fund in order to get that density. And that number we review every year to make sure it makes sense for an acre going into conservation.
And so it's essentially like the city's the counterparty. Like if the counterparty in the vanilla TDR is like another property owner, in this case the city's the counterparty, and that's so like you're receiving those funds and expending them.
Right, or people are allowed to do it privately, but usually we have some sort of skin in the game between the site plan or subdivision that would be going in anyway.
Gotcha.
We got a few sorry, June, a few other questions here. General is from Robert. Genuine general question. Shouldn't zoning already reflect ideal densities in different areas? Is TDR sort of a pay-to-play zoning strategy? Where might TDR be a better fit than permissive zoning?
I mean, I think this is a great point, Robert. I think this isn't a totally satisfying answer, because I think as all like good planners, we do feel that zoning should always reflect the sort of underlying best case, scenario, all things considered. I think the Stowe example is an interesting one, because part of that strategy was they didn't want to, I believe, and it's a sort of older story, so I think I'm getting this right. But they didn't want to essentially devalue the land they wanted to conserve, and like take away the value that the rural landowner would otherwise receive. So this is a way of not totally devaluing the land and potentially getting into a takings fight, while still shifting that potential from a place that it was less desirable to a place that it was more desirable. So not a super satisfying answer, but I think it's in the real politic of planning and potential takings. Like it's something that could make sense. I don't know if there's a more idealistic response.
Well, it's also, I mean, this all comes back to, this was a toolbox used, right? And this TDR is a tool that you can use. So in addition to your underlying zoning, when a criteria has been met and when the planning board feels that this is a good situation and ordinance to utilize, they can, but they don't necessarily have to. It's not a blanket, right? You still need to get that approval from planning board and make sure you're meeting criteria.
A lot of times the implementation does have heavy involvement from the planning board, to even like in a sort of vanilla scheme where there's the seller and the purchaser. The planning board is usually authorizing the development up front. So like there's no transaction without a development approval in the first place. And in that way, it almost becomes like a planned unit development, something that's more an ad hoc strategy for more complex cases, like the cottages at Back River Road.
Great. I think both of those responses were very helpful. We have a question from Renee. I think this is really for you, Donna. What are some of your lessons learned with implementation in Dover?
So one that I personally am trying to still figure out is in 2018, when we added in the size restrictions, we were hoping that would help with affordability. So we would restrict them at, I think a lot of people use the 1,400 square feet. So there were a couple different developments that came in, asked for the TDR, were granted the TDR, and as part of that request wanted to size restrict them to 1,400 square feet. And we said, great, hoping that would keep that building and home cost down. But when they got their potential buyers, they wanted to add in the granite countertops and kind of the fancier finishes. And all of a sudden, I was seeing these homes listed on the MLS for like in 2018, like high fives, mid sixes. And I was like, this isn't the purpose. And I think we heard that from the planning board too. This was not the purpose of size restricting it and then still having these more expensive homes, which now would be probably high eights. So I think that's one lesson learned. I'm personally debating trying to take out that size restriction just because I think it's now driving up the per square foot cost of other units in the city. But that's not a change that we've made yet. So I think that's one of my biggest takeaways. And yes, I think certainly about how you present it as an option or answer questions about it for abutters, because certainly people have come and said, oh, so you can just buy your way out of zoning. And it's like, I can see how it comes across that way, but highlighting the benefits, highlighting the fact that the Open Lands Committee is actually using this money to conserve land where it makes more sense to conserve that land, and that density is being used where it makes more sense, is I think the key takeaways and lessons learned.
Great. And then another question for you, Donna, from Ryan. How much money has been contributed to the Conservation Fund by way of TDR unit purchases?
I want to say it's between $1.5 to $2 million.
Cool.
I don't know right off the top of my head, but I think it's somewhere in there.
And then a question from Stephanie, again for Donna. What was the sending property for, you said for the Dover development, I assume for the cottages project?
So that one didn't. That one was one where they just paid into the conservation fund and they didn't have to have the sending. So they, instead of having the land to swap, they paid into it, but that fee, of course, was zero because they ended up doing the HUD rent restriction.
Great. And then another question from Renee, also for you, Donna. Do you cap the number of conservation of the number or the conservation acreage that can be purchased for TDR?
So we haven't capped it, but we do, it does have to be realistic. So it does have to still meet the traffic study standards and kind of pass a straight face test both to staff and then when it gets to the technical review committee and then again at planning board. So certainly there, we don't have a max cap, but I think based off traffic, based off capacity of utilities, that type of thing, we're able to kind of make sure it's realistic.
Great. I'm not seeing any other questions. I'm going to ask one more question. I know we're coming up on 1 o'clock. This is more for you, June. Obviously, many, Dover had the benefit of being a city where they didn't have to they could create this program without going to town meeting and getting zoning changes to incorporate it into their zoning ordinance. Do you have it? And I know some other communities that have town meeting have struggled with, getting it passed because there haven't been agreement on the sending and receiving zones, and they kind of get caught up in that. Do you have any thoughts or kind of recommendations for kind of smaller communities that have to go through the town meeting process for zoning changes that want to consider doing TDR on how to kind of get over that initial hurdle and get everybody comfortable with the idea? You're on mute.
Thanks. I do think this is where the public engagement upfront comes into play more than anything else, and sort of giving yourself a long enough timeline to let that play its course. In terms of how to set up the sending and receiving zones in a way that might be more palatable, I think Dover's strategy of connecting it to existing underlying zoning districts that might be a successful strategy in certain communities because those lines are already drawn, they're already established. In the case of Dover, it was like taking those and adding the little like turnpike division as a way to create sort of a new distinction. So in certain communities, that might be a great strategy to sort of even out some of that argument. Otherwise, in other communities, that could be more problematic if the base district boundaries aren't great. So I might be a more community by community concern, but my impulse there is that if you have base districts that reflect some sort of real difference in community character, that would be the place to start.
Great, thank you. Donna, I don't know
All
if you
right.
had anything to add or not, but
No, I think that handled it well of making sure you have the buy-in and really promoting it and have the reasoning behind it.
great, thank you.
So thank you for sticking out to the end here. TDR is an exciting tool, and I'm glad we got to explore it a little bit more today. Next week, we'll be discussing RSA 79E. That's tax relief for housing, and we'll be discussing the community revitalization tax relief incentive, that sort of, typical 79E, more established 79E. But we'll also be discussing housing opportunity zones, which is a relatively new provision within 79E. So sort of both that base case and the housing opportunity zones together. And then the following week, June 29th, we'll be discussing form-based codes and sort of intuitive housing for zoning, intuitive zoning for housing through form-based codes. So exciting two more presentations here. I feel like we should be giving out badges for folks who make it to all 5 of them, but we'll look into that. And with that, thank you so much, Donna. Really appreciate your input here. It was great. Thanks to everyone who attended and asked questions. It's an exciting time here in New Hampshire. Thank you.